My name is Arianne Richard, and I am 29 years old. Just a few days ago, while I was vomiting bile into a plastic basin on day 4 of an emergency surgical recovery, my family decided it was the perfect time to break into my house for a free beach vacation. They did not call to see if I survived the operating table. They just tracked my hospital stay to calculate exactly how many days they could commandeer the coastal sanctuary I bled to buy. I watched them through my security cameras, drinking my expensive wine and letting their kids ruin my custom furniture. So I dialed my smart home provider, locked them out in their damp swimsuits, and went back to sleep. Before I tell you what happened when the police arrived, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories, but only if you believe in setting boundaries with toxic family members. Drop your age, your location, and the local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Now let me take you to the sterile silence of a room at Yale New Haven Hospital. My abdomen felt like it had been stitched together with barbed wire. It was day 4 post-op for a ruptured appendix. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, steady note. The air smelled of iodine and stale linen. I reached for my phone on the plastic tray table, my fingers stiff and cold. Out of sheer habit, I opened my banking app. A red arrow pointed downward next to my credit score. A 5-point drop. My foggy brain tried to process the number, but a push notification from my home security system slid across the top of the screen. Motion detected at the patio door. I tapped the alert. The screen buffered for a fraction of a second before displaying the crisp, high-definition feed of my backyard in Milford. The sun was shining on the cedar deck I had stained myself last summer, and there was my brother Julian hauling a cooler toward my sliding glass doors. Behind him, my sister Beatrice dragged 2 folding beach chairs while her toddlers chased each other through my perennial garden. Julian set the cooler down, reached into a grocery bag, and pulled out a bottle with a distinct silver wax seal. The vintage Pinot Noir I had been saving for my 30th birthday. He pulled a corkscrew from his pocket. He was already making himself at home. My breath hitched, pulling painfully at my fresh incisions. I had not given anyone a key. I had not invited them. Since the ambulance took me away on Tuesday night, my phone had remained silent. No texts asking how the surgery went, no calls from my mother. Just radio silence from the people who shared my DNA. The plastic basin on my lap smelled of sickness. I pushed it aside, ignoring the sharp pull in my lower right side. The contrast was almost too much to process. I was calculating the timing of my next pain pill, and my family was calculating the tide schedule. I pressed the 2-way audio button on the app, my thumb hovering over the microphone icon. Through the tiny speaker, I heard Julian laugh. The sound echoed off the siding of the house I bought with 80-hour work weeks and skipped meals. I did not press speak. Instead, I opened my recent contacts and dialed my mother. As my legally designated medical proxy, she was the only person who knew exactly how long I was supposed to be trapped in this hospital bed. The phone felt like a block of lead in my trembling hand. I stared at Sandra's name on the screen for a long moment, listening to the steady beep of my heart monitor. My mother. The woman who was supposed to be sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl chair next to my bed, feeding me ice chips and asking the surgical team about my recovery timeline. Instead, she was 30 miles away, trespassing on my property. I tapped the green call icon and pressed the device to my ear. The line rang twice before she picked up. A rush of ambient noise flooded the earpiece. I heard the distinct cry of a seagull, the rhythmic crashing of the Long Island Sound against the shoreline, and the high-pitched squeal of Beatrice's youngest daughter. "Arianne," Sandra answered. Her voice was bright, breezy, and entirely devoid of concern. "I saw the hospital called yesterday. You are out of surgery, right? Just a routine appendix thing." I squeezed my eyes shut. The sharp pain in my lower right abdomen flared. A burning reminder that there was nothing routine about being rushed into an operating room at 2 a.m. "I am on day 4 of recovery," I said, my voice raspy from the intubation tube they had pulled from my throat a few days prior. "I just threw up bile." And my security app just showed me Julian opening a bottle of my vintage wine on my back deck. There was a brief pause on the line. I expected a flurry of apologies, a frantic explanation, or even a sudden burst of maternal guilt. Instead, a heavy sigh crackled through the speaker. Arianne. Stop being dramatic, Sandra said, her tone dropping into that familiar, patronizing register she always used when I dared to assert a boundary. You are stuck in a hospital bed anyway. The house sitting empty is a waste. Julian is stressed with his real estate work, and Beatrice's kids need the beach air. We decided to make a little family weekend out of it. We decided, I repeated, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone. Who is we? I own that house. I pay the mortgage. I did not invite any of you. Oh, please, she scoffed. Do not pull that selfish routine today. I found the spare key. My stomach dropped. 3 years ago, right after I closed on the distressed foreclosure, I buried a cheap brass key inside a fake hollow rock near the hydrangea bushes. I told my mother about it for true life or death emergencies. A fire, a flood, a scenario where I was incapacitated and someone needed to feed a pet or grab vital documents. You dug up my emergency key for a beach vacation? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It is not a big deal, Sandra countered, the sound of ice clinking in a glass echoing on her end. Julian has had a rough quarter. You know the housing market is tough right now. He needs to unwind. Beatrice is crammed in that tiny apartment with 2 toddlers. You have 3 bedrooms right on the water. You are a single woman who works from home. You do not need all that space to yourself. It is only fair you share the wealth with the people who are actually raising families. The words hit me like a physical blow, yet they were not surprising. This was the unwritten doctrine of the Richard family. I was the workaholic spinster. I was the one who skipped family dinners to finish data analysis reports. I took out my own student loans, paid them off early, and scraped together a down payment while my parents funneled their savings into Julian's failed business ventures and Beatrice's lavish wedding. In their eyes, my success was not a personal achievement. It was a communal resource. Because I did not have a husband or children, my money, my time, and my property were deemed public domain for the married siblings who were struggling. Put Julian on the phone, I demanded, ignoring the throbbing ache in my side. I want you all out of my house right now. Pack up your coolers and leave. The breezy tone vanished from Sandra's voice. The silence stretched tight, brittle, and cold. Listen to me very carefully, Arianne, she said, her words clipped and precise. I am your legally designated medical proxy. I am your emergency contact. I spoke to your floor nurse this morning. I know exactly what kind of heavy narcotics they are pumping into your IV. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. If you try to ruin this weekend for your brother and sister, I will call the charge nurse, Sandra continued, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. I will tell them you are having a severe post-operative psychological episode. I will say the pain medications are making you paranoid and hostile toward your family. They will flag your chart. They might even request a psychiatric hold. Do you want to spend an extra 3 days in that bed answering questions from a hospital social worker? She delivered the threat with casual ease. She was weaponizing the very power I had entrusted to her. She thought she held all the cards. She thought the single, exhausted daughter in the hospital bed would just fold, cry into her pillow, and let them enjoy their stolen vacation. Are we clear? Sandra asked. Crystal, I whispered. I ended the call. The phone felt slippery in my sweaty palm. My heart hammered against my ribs, setting off a rapid series of high-pitched beeps on the bedside monitor. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, inhaling the scent of bleach and sterile gauze. I did not cry. The hurt had burned away the moment she threatened me with a psychiatric hold. In its place, a cold, calculating clarity settled over my mind. I was a data analyst. I solved complex problems for a living by finding the weakest point in a system and dismantling it. Sandra had just revealed her primary point of leverage. I tapped the Yale New Haven patient portal app on my home screen. Facial recognition unlocked my medical chart instantly. I navigated past the lab results and surgical notes, scrolling directly down to the administrative section. Legal directives and emergency contacts. There it was. Sandra Richard, listed as primary medical proxy, authorized to receive medical updates and make decisions in the event of incapacitation. My finger hovered over the screen. This was the umbilical cord of control she had used to keep me tethered to her authority. She assumed the legal paperwork we filed years ago was carved in stone. She failed to realize we lived in a digital age, and I had the patient rights portal right in the palm of my hand. I tapped the edit button. I deleted her phone number. I deleted her home address. I selected the bright red icon that read, Revoke Proxy Status. A warning prompt popped up, asking if I was sure I wanted to remove this individual from my care team. I tapped Confirm. Just like that, the digital tether was severed. Sandra was no longer my medical proxy. She was no longer authorized to speak to my nurses, access my chart, or demand a psychiatric evaluation. Legally speaking, she was now just a stranger trespassing on my property. I closed the hospital app and reopened my security feed. The situation in my backyard was escalating. The camera angle shifted slightly as the wind picked up off the water. Beatrice's toddlers were no longer in the garden. They had moved into my living room. Through the sliding glass doors, I could see them climbing onto the custom-ordered white linen sofa I had waited 6 months to be delivered. My thumb hovered over the smart lock controls, but I realized simply locking the door would not be enough. They were already inside, settling in, getting comfortable. They were touching my things. I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to push this invasion before I dropped the digital guillotine. The hospital room faded into the background as I focused entirely on the glowing rectangle in my hands. The sharp sting in my abdomen became secondary to the cold focus sharpening in my mind. I swiped left on the smart home application, bypassing the patio feed and accessing the interior network. When I renovated the distressed Milford property, I did not just upgrade the drywall and plumbing. As a data analyst handling sensitive corporate information, I treated my home security with the same rigorous standard I applied to server firewalls. The interior cameras were discreet, seamlessly integrated into motion sensors and smoke detectors. My family operated under the outdated assumption that a single woman living alone was inherently vulnerable and technologically inept. They believed I only had a basic doorbell camera, which they had cleverly bypassed by using the side gate. They had no idea they had just walked onto a digital soundstage, wired to capture every whisper and every footstep in glorious high definition. I tapped the living room feed. The wide-angle lens offered a pristine, color-saturated view of the space I loved most. The afternoon sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the focal point of the room. My custom-ordered white linen sofa. Beatrice's 4-year-old twins, Mason and Lily, were sprinting laps around the coffee table. Each child gripped a melting cherry popsicle. The bright red artificial syrup dripped down their wrists, pooling onto the hardwood floor. I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and fascination, as Mason scrambled onto the pristine white cushions. He wiped his sticky, crimson-coated hands directly onto the armrest to steady himself, then began jumping. Lily followed, her popsicle sliding against the backrest, leaving a vibrant, wet streak of red dye across the imported fabric. A visceral flashback hit me, tight and breathless. I was 25 years old, sitting on the floor of a cramped studio apartment in Stamford. I was drowning in student debt, working 80-hour weeks for a ruthless tech firm. I remembered the endless diet of instant ramen, the exhaustion burning my eyes, and the complex Excel spreadsheets I built to track every single penny I earned. That sofa was not just a piece of furniture, it was a trophy. It represented the moment I finally broke free from financial instability. It was the physical manifestation of my independence, purchased with my own blood and sweat. In the corner of the camera feed, Beatrice walked into the frame. She wore a damp swimsuit and carried a sandy beach tote. She glanced at her children destroying my prized possession, shrugged, and pulled out her smartphone. She sat down on the matching accent chair, dripping salt water onto the upholstery, and began scrolling through social media. She did not utter a single word of correction. In her mind, she had provided the Richard family with grandchildren, elevating her status to the true adult of the sibling dynamic. Because I had no children, my worldly possessions were merely props for her offspring to enjoy. The sting of that realization was sharp, but the true agony was yet to come. I switched the feed to the kitchen island. The marble countertops were supposed to be my recovery station. Before the ambulance arrived, I had painstakingly arranged everything I would need upon my return. Stacks of sterile gauze, medical tape, prescribed antibiotics, and a specific brand of electrolyte water were lined up next to the sink. Julian strolled into the kitchen. He wore a designer linen shirt that I knew he had purchased on a maxed-out credit card. His failing real estate career required him to project an image of effortless wealth, an illusion funded entirely by our parents borrowing against their retirement. He carried 2 heavy plastic grocery bags, setting them down on the edge of the island. He needed space to unpack his haul. He looked at my neatly arranged medical supplies. He picked up the amber pill bottle containing the strong pain medication the surgical team had prescribed me for the first few days of home recovery. He squinted at the label, reading my name. Then, he grabbed a black plastic trash bag from beneath the sink. With a casual, sweeping motion of his arm, Julian pushed my gauze, my antiseptic, and my prescription painkillers directly into the garbage. He tossed the trash bag into the corner, out of sight. Having cleared the necessary space, he began unloading his items. Premium cocktail mixers, an expensive bottle of imported gin, fresh limes, and a sleek stainless steel cocktail shaker. I stopped breathing. The monitor beside my hospital bed let out a rapid series of warning tones, detecting my sudden spike in heart rate. He had not just ruined a piece of furniture, he had thrown away the vital supplies keeping me from developing a postoperative infection. He had discarded the medication meant to manage the excruciating pain of my severed tissue. He prioritized his evening gin and tonics over my basic physical safety. My phone vibrated violently against my palm, interrupting the camera feed. An incoming call from Julian. I stared at his smiling contact photo. I did not answer. I let the phone ring until the automated voicemail system took over. 2 minutes later, a notification popped up indicating a new audio message. I split my phone screen, keeping the kitchen live feed open on the top half while I tapped play on the audio file below. Julian's voice drifted from the tiny speaker, smooth, confident, and dripping with fake gratitude. "Hey, Ari, it is Julian. Just calling to check in. Mom said the surgery was a success and you are resting up. Hope the hospital food is not treating you too poorly. We are having a great time here. The weather is perfect. Just wanted to leave a quick message to say thank you again for letting us crash. We are taking great care of the place. We will leave it spotless, I promise. Focus on getting better. See you soon." The sheer audacity of the lie sent a wave of intoxicating, dramatic irony straight into my veins. As his recorded voice promised to leave my sanctuary spotless, the top half of my screen displayed a new scene. Julian had moved from the kitchen into my home office, carrying a delivery box. He kicked his sandy shoes off, leaving debris on the floorboards, and stepped onto the intricate woven silk of my imported Persian rug. He dropped the greasy, oversized cardboard pizza box directly onto the center of the delicate tapestry. I zoomed in on the high-definition feed. I could actually see the dark, circular stain of hot grease seeping through the bottom of the cardboard, transferring a permanent ring of oil deep into the expensive silk fibers. He grabbed a slice, bit into it, and let a glob of melted cheese fall onto the floor. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and walked away, leaving the box to ruin the rug. They thought they were getting away with the perfect crime. They believed their little sister was incapacitated, drugged, and blind to their behavior. They trusted that their charming voicemails and fabricated narratives would protect them, just as those tactics had protected them for our entire lives. They were completely unaware that the data analyst they so frequently dismissed was currently cataloging every single transgression. I opened a secure, encrypted folder on my cloud drive. I began clipping the video files. I saved the footage of the cherry popsicles staining the linen sofa. I isolated the exact timestamp of Julian sweeping my prescription medication into the trash. I downloaded the audio file of his deceptive voicemail, pairing it directly with the footage of the grease-stained pizza box on the Persian rug. File by file, I built an undeniable, high-resolution archive of their entitlement. The pain in my abdomen dulled, replaced by the thrilling, dangerous momentum of gathering raw data. Information was power, and they had just handed me a mountain of it. I watched Beatrice return to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of my vintage wine. They were settling in for a comfortable evening. The sun was beginning to set over the Long Island Sound, casting long, golden shadows across my desecrated living room. Soon the temperature would drop. Soon they would want to go out for dinner or take a walk along the beach. They would leave the house. They would assume the old brass spare key in Sandra's purse would guarantee their re-entry. I closed the camera application and opened the master control panel for my smart home security grid. It was time to show them exactly who owned this property, and it was time to change the rules of engagement. The surgical staples in my right side pulled tight, sending a sharp warning signal to my brain. I ignored the physical discomfort. The cold glow of my smartphone screen provided all the anesthetic I needed. For 29 years, that old brass key buried under the hydrangeas had represented my biggest flaw. It was the physical manifestation of my guilt. No matter how far I moved, no matter how hard I worked to establish my own life, I always left a back door open for the Richards. I had allowed them to maintain a silent lease on my independence. My fingers hovered over the proprietary security application interface. When I purchased the coastal property, I invested heavily in an enterprise-grade titanium deadbolt. The system was designed for commercial tech hubs, not suburban homes. It featured a physical cylinder for traditional entry, but its true power lay in the motorized internal clutch mechanism. I navigated to the device management dashboard. The user interface displayed a list of active access methods. Julian's temporary guest code, which I had never authorized, sat at the top. Below that was the physical key bypass option. With a single tap, I deleted Julian's entry pin. A tiny red trash can icon swallowed the numbers, permanently erasing his digital footprint. Next, I selected the Advanced Security Protocol menu. I found the toggle labeled Disable Mechanical Override. My thumb paused over the screen. Pressing that button would engage a secondary steel pin inside the lock housing, disconnecting the exterior keyway from the latch. Even with the original brass key, turning the cylinder would do nothing. The door would remain sealed tight. It was the digital equivalent of dropping a medieval portcullis. I pressed the toggle. A green checkmark flared on my display. The transition of power was instantaneous. I was no longer just a patient recovering in a sterile room. I had become the architect of an impenetrable fortress. I wiped every remaining access code, engaging the biometric and registered administrator device only mode. The digital guillotine fell silent and swift. I needed a reliable witness on the ground. I opened my messages and started a new thread with Barbara Gable. Barbara lived in the slate-gray colonial next door. She was a 72-year-old retired corporate paralegal who spent her days cultivating prize-winning dahlias and sitting on her wraparound porch with a pair of high-powered binoculars. We bonded during my first month in the neighborhood when she threatened to sue a rogue landscaping company for blowing yard debris onto my freshly paved driveway. Barbara understood property lines, legal boundaries, and the importance of a well-documented paper trail. I typed a concise message. Barbara, my family has entered my home without permission while I am in the hospital. I just remotely disabled all locks. Could you please keep an eye on my driveway and let me know when they leave for the evening? The typing indicator bubbles appeared almost immediately. Say no. I returned to the live camera feeds to monitor my newly secured perimeter. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower toward the horizon, casting elongated shadows across my hardwood floors. Inside the house, the vacationers were growing restless. Beatrice stood by the kitchen island, adjusting the straps of a fresh floral sundress. She applied a thick layer of lip gloss, staring into the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator door. Her twins were running in circles around the ruined linen sofa, their energy spiking from the artificial sugar in the cherry popsicles. Julian emerged from the guest bathroom, smelling strongly of my expensive imported cologne. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. He was preparing for an evening out, likely to scout the local upscale bars and pretend he was a wealthy local rather than a failing real estate broker drowning in hidden debt. Sandra walked into the frame, carrying her oversized designer tote bag. She retrieved the old brass key from the kitchen counter and dropped it into a zippered pocket. She patted the leather exterior with a smug sense of satisfaction. In her mind, that piece of metal was a symbol of unshakable authority. She believed it guaranteed her permanent access to the fruits of my labor. "Everyone grab a sweater," Sandra commanded, her voice carrying clearly through the hidden microphone. "The breeze off the water gets chilly after dusk. We will grab dinner at that seafood place on the pier, walk the boardwalk, and come back here for drinks on the patio." Julian grabbed his car keys from the entryway table. Beatrice wrangled the toddlers toward the front door. They moved with the relaxed, entitled swagger of people who believed the world existed solely to cater to their comfort. I watched the procession through the lens of the doorbell camera. Julian stepped out onto the porch first, followed by Beatrice and the kids. Sandra exited last. She paused to admire my blooming hydrangeas, oblivious to the silent trap waiting mere inches from her hand. She pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind her. A crisp, audible, mechanical click echoed through the audio feed. The smart deadbolt automatically engaged, driving the thick titanium rod deep into the reinforced steel strike plate. The motorized clutch detached the exterior key cylinder. They walked down the driveway toward Julian's SUV, laughing and arguing over dinner choices. They piled into the vehicle, the engine roared to life, and the car backed out into the street. The taillights disappeared around the corner, heading toward the beach promenade. My phone buzzed. A text from Barbara. "The targets have vacated the premises," she wrote. "Vehicle departed at 5:42 p.m. Porch is clear." I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, letting the adrenaline wash over me in cooling waves. The throbbing ache in my lower abdomen returned, but it felt manageable now. The playing field had fundamentally changed. My home was empty, the perimeter was secured, the trap was primed. For the next 2 hours, the hospital room was quiet. Nurses came and went, checking my vitals and emptying my IV bags. They noted my elevated heart rate, but attributed it to post-surgical stress. I did not correct them. I simply stared at my screen, watching the sun sink below the horizon on the Milford coastline. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The temperature dropped, just as Sandra had predicted. The streetlights flickered on, casting yellow halos onto the empty pavement of my driveway. I reviewed the compiled folder of video evidence I had gathered earlier. The stained sofa, the ruined Persian rug, the discarded prescription medication. Every file was securely backed up to a remote server. The data was safe. My case was solidifying with every passing minute. At 7:14 p.m., my screen illuminated with an urgent message from Barbara Gable. "They are back," the text read, "pulling into the driveway now." I sat up slightly, wincing as the staples bit into my skin. I opened the application and tapped the front porch camera feed. Julian's SUV parked haphazardly on the paving stones. The doors swung open. Beatrice climbed out, carrying a sleeping toddler over her shoulder. Sandra shivered in the evening air, wrapping a thin cardigan tightly around her shoulders. Julian locked the car, leading the group up the front walkway. They approached the heavy mahogany door. Sandra dug into her designer tote bag, her fingers searching for the brass key. She found it, holding it up with a triumphant flourish. The digital guillotine was about to drop, and I had a front row seat to the execution. The notification chime broke the sterile quiet of my hospital room at exactly 7:15 in the evening. I tapped the screen. The front porch camera feed opened, filling my display with the crisp twilight of the Connecticut coastline. The shadows were long and dark. The temperature had plunged. The sea breeze whipped through the neighborhood, carrying the distinct chill of early summer evenings on the Long Island Sound. My uninvited guests stumbled into the frame. The relaxed, entitled swagger they carried earlier had vanished. They looked exhausted. Beatrice dragged her feet, clutching a white paper bag filled with leftover fried seafood. Her twins trailed behind her, whining in a pitch that made the camera microphone crackle. Underneath their thin sweaters, their swimsuits were still damp from the state park beach. Julian stepped up to the entrance. He held a half-empty bottle of expensive sparkling water. He did not bother to look at the camera lens. He was too confident. He was a man who believed the world would always yield to his presence. He extended his index finger and punched his old numerical code into the glowing keypad. A harsh, synthetic buzz erupted from the speaker. The keypad flashed a bright crimson light. Error. Julian frowned. He wiped his finger on his linen shirt, muttering something about cheap technology and dirty sensors. He punched the numbers in again, pressing harder this time, as if brute force could rewrite my security protocols. Buzz, red light, error. He let out a sharp breath and slapped his open palm against the thick mahogany wood. The dull thud reverberated through my phone speaker. He stepped back, staring at the keypad like it had personally insulted him. Sandra pushed past him. She carried her heavy designer tote bag on her forearm, shivering as a gust of wind caught her thin cardigan. She rolled her eyes at Julian. Delivering a lecture I could hear perfectly through the audio feed. "This is why I told her not to buy all these ridiculous gadgets," Sandra scolded, shaking her head. "Everything has to be a smart device with Arianne. It is just pretentious. Move out of the way. I have the real key." She reached into the zippered pocket of her bag and produced the tarnished brass key she had dug up from my garden. She held it up for Julian to see, presenting it as the ultimate solution to my supposed technological incompetence. She stepped forward and slid the metal into the cylinder. I held my breath, ignoring the throbbing ache where the surgical staples held my abdomen together. Sandra turned her wrist. The key rotated smoothly in a full circle. Nothing else happened. She turned it the other way. It spun without resistance. Because I had engaged the digital override, the motorized clutch inside the deadbolt housing had physically detached the keyway from the locking mechanism. She was turning a useless piece of metal. Her confident expression fractured. She gripped the brass bow with both hands, twisting it back and forth in a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm. She grabbed the heavy handle and yanked downward. The titanium deadbolt held the door firmly anchored to the reinforced steel strike plate. The barrier did not budge a single millimeter. "It is broken," Sandra announced, panic creeping into the edges of her voice. She pulled the key out and inspected the teeth, as if the metal had somehow changed shape. "The lock is jammed. She bought a defective lock." The reality of their situation began to settle over the porch. The cold wind howled louder. Beatrice dropped her bag of leftover food onto the paving stones. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, shivering uncontrollably. Her curated reality of a perfect, free vacation was shattering right in front of her eyes. "What do you mean it is jammed?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and piercing. "Open the door, Mom. Mason is freezing. Lily needs her asthma inhaler, and all of their tablets are inside." Beatrice pressed her face against the narrow sidelight window next to the door. She cupped her hands over her eyes to block the glare from the streetlights. Through the glass, she could see the warm, inviting glow of my hallway. She could see her sandy beach tote sitting right there on my entryway console table, mere inches away, but guarded by an impenetrable fortress of my design. "I left my expensive face creams in her bathroom," Beatrice whined, turning back to Julian. "Do something. Break the lock. Call a locksmith. We cannot stand out here in the dark." Julian paced the length of the porch, rubbing his temples. His carefully styled hair was a mess from the wind. His premium linen shirt offered zero protection from the dropping temperature. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen. Seconds later, my device vibrated on the plastic hospital tray. A text message from Julian. "Hey, Ari, the front door lock is glitching. We cannot get in. Call me back so we can troubleshoot." He was still playing the role of the polite, concerned brother. He still believed this was a technological error. He had not yet realized he was the victim of a calculated eviction. I ignored the text. I picked up a small plastic cup from my bedside table. It was filled with cheap hospital water and half-melted ice chips. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid soothed my dry throat. My phone screen lit up again. Sandra was calling. I watched her contact photo flash on my display. Through the live camera feed, I watched the actual woman standing on my porch, holding her phone to her ear, tapping her expensive leather shoes impatiently against the stone steps. She looked furious. She expected me to answer on the first ring, apologize for the inconvenience, and immediately dispatch a professional to fix her problem. I let the call ring. I watched her pull the phone away from her ear as the automated voicemail system engaged. She let out an exasperated sigh and began recording her message. "Arianne, pick up your phone right now," Sandra demanded, her tone shifting from maternal annoyance to outright hostility. "We are standing outside in the freezing cold. Your stupid high-tech door is broken. Beatrice has 2 freezing children out here. Call the company and have them reset it. I am not playing games with you tonight." She ended the call and shoved the device back into her bag. I tapped the screen, archiving the voicemail directly into the secure cloud folder I had built for my mounting evidence. It was a beautiful addition to the collection. Julian lost his patience. The text messages began pouring in, lighting up my screen in rapid succession. "Pick up the phone." "Ari, this is not funny." "Unlock this door right now. Our stuff is in there." "Stop acting like a psycho and let us in." The transition from arrogant entitlement to desperate pleading was a fascinating psychological study. They were stranded on a dark porch, trapped in damp swimsuits and thin sweaters. They had treated my life's greatest achievement like a cheap motel. They had assumed I was too weak, too drugged, and too docile to fight back. They thought my success was their safety net. I took another sip of my ice water. The physical pain in my surgical wounds was entirely overshadowed by the profound, chilling satisfaction of taking back my power. I was a data analyst. I spent my life looking at numbers, identifying patterns, and eliminating liabilities. My family was the greatest liability I possessed, and I had just locked them out of the equation. Julian stopped pacing. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. His ego, fragile and inflated by years of parental coddling, could not handle being defeated by a piece of wood and a digital lock. He glared at the camera lens for a brief moment, breathing heavily. Then he stepped off the porch. I switched my application view, bringing up the secondary camera feed covering the side garden and the large pane glass windows of my living room. Julian marched into the garden, his leather shoes sinking into my fresh mulch. He stopped in front of the decorative retaining wall I had built last spring. He bent down and wrapped his hands around a heavy concrete landscaping stone. He lifted it with a grunt, his muscles straining under the weight. He turned around, his eyes fixed firmly on the expensive glass window standing between him and his warm vacation. He was about to cross the invisible line from mere trespassing to felony property damage. He thought he could use brute force to reclaim his stolen authority. My thumb hovered over the red emergency dispatch icon on my security application. The trap was fully primed, and he was about to step right into the jaws. Julian hoisted the heavy concrete landscaping block up to his chest. His expensive linen shirt strained against the broad lines of his shoulders. The veins in his neck pushed against his skin as he squared his stance directly in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of my living room. He was a man accustomed to avoiding consequences. Whenever his terrible business decisions cornered him, our parents always arrived with a checkbook to smooth over the damage. He had never faced a physical barrier he could not bully his way through. and he was fully prepared to shatter a $1,000 pane of custom glass just to retrieve his imported gin. I did not dial the local police precinct. I knew that calling a standard dispatcher and explaining the complex, toxic web of my family dynamics would only result in the authorities labeling the situation a civil dispute. They would hesitate to intervene in a domestic squabble. I needed a swift, tactical response. I navigated to the emergency dashboard on my security application. A glowing red shield icon sat at the bottom of the display. It was a direct line to the private monitoring center that oversaw my alarm system. I pressed my thumb against the screen and held it there until the progress bar filled. A text prompt appeared, asking for the nature of the emergency. I typed a concise, factual sentence. Unidentified individuals are actively tampering with my security hardware and attempting to break through the rear glass of my residence. I hit send. The application confirmed the dispatch. The response time in my affluent coastal neighborhood was notoriously short. I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows. The surgical staples in my abdomen burned, but the pain was a distant hum compared to the roaring adrenaline in my ears. On the camera feed, the first heavy drops of a summer squall began to fall. The sky had bruised into a dark, stormy purple. The wind whipped off the Long Island Sound, driving the cold rain sideways across my pristine lawn. Julian hesitated. The cold water hit his face, making him blink rapidly. He stood there holding the heavy concrete stone, shivering in the sudden downpour. Behind him, on the porch, Beatrice shrieked as the rain soaked her thin sundress. She tried to herd her crying toddlers under the narrow overhang of the doorway, but there was not enough room to shield them from the wind. Sandra stood beside the driveway, her leather designer tote bag pressed against her chest in a futile attempt to protect it from the weather. She yelled something at Julian. The wind distorted her words, but her frantic hand gestures indicated she was warning him about the cost of replacing the window. Even in the middle of a crisis, Sandra was always calculating the financial liability. Julian ignored her. He widened his stance, pulling the heavy concrete block back toward his right shoulder. He was winding up for the throw. Before he could launch the stone, the piercing wail of a siren sliced through the sound of the crashing waves. Julian froze. He lowered the block slightly, his head snapping toward the street. 2 Milford police cruisers turned the corner at the end of the block. Their tires hissed against the wet asphalt. Red and blue strobe lights painted the neighborhood in frantic, sweeping colors. The cruisers accelerated, jumping the curb slightly as they angled their vehicles to form a barricade across the base of my driveway. 4 officers stepped out of the patrol cars simultaneously. They did not look like neighborhood beat cops responding to a noise complaint. They moved with coordinated precision, their hands resting on their dark utility belts. The driving rain caught the bright beams of their heavy tactical flashlights as they swept the beams across the front yard. One of the brilliant white beams landed squarely on Julian. He was standing in the wet grass, caught red-handed, holding a massive piece of landscaping concrete inches away from a glass wall. "Drop the stone and step away from the house," a stern voice echoed through a patrol car megaphone. Julian dropped the concrete block as if it had caught fire. It landed in the mud with a dull thud, splashing dirty water onto his designer shoes. He raised his empty hands into the air, his bravado instantly evaporating. The confident real estate broker disappeared, replaced by a terrified man realizing his parental safety net was nowhere to be found. Sandra rushed forward, stepping into the glaring beam of the police flashlights. She activated her default defense mechanism. She adopted the persona of an aggrieved, wealthy matriarch who was simply suffering an administrative error. "Officers, please. There has been a terrible misunderstanding," Sandra announced. She projected her voice over the sound of the rain, waving her hand dismissively. "We are not intruders. This is my daughter's house. We are on a family vacation, and her high-tech door lock is malfunctioning. We were just trying to get inside to warm up the children." The lead officer, a tall man wearing a transparent rain slicker over his uniform, did not lower his flashlight. He approached Sandra slowly, his expression hidden behind the glare. "Ma'am, please step back onto the pavement," the officer instructed, his tone polite but firm. Can you produce a form of identification showing your primary residence is this address?" Sandra scoffed, acting as though the request was deeply offensive. "I do not live here. My daughter does. Her name is Arianne Richard. I have a spare key right here in my bag." She began digging frantically into her ruined leather tote. The officer raised a gloved hand, ordering her to stop reaching into the concealed compartment. "Do not pull anything out of the bag, ma'am." He gestured to his partner, who was typing rapidly into a waterproof mobile terminal mounted on his utility belt. "We ran the property deed and the utility registrations on the way over," the second officer stated. "The residence belongs solely to an Arianne Richard. There are no other names on the title." "That is what I just told you," Sandra insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "I am her mother. This man is her brother. Those are her nieces and nephews. We have every right to be here. Having a relative who owns the property does not grant you legal access to bypass a locked perimeter," the lead officer explained. He turned his flashlight toward Julian, who was still standing with his hands raised in the rain. "Especially not when the alarm monitoring company reports an active break-in attempt, and we arrive to find a man preparing to throw a cinder block through a plate glass window." Beatrice stepped off the porch, dragging her crying twins by their hands. The toddlers were shivering violently, their lips turning a pale shade of blue. "Officer, please, my babies are freezing," Beatrice pleaded. "Our dry clothes and car keys are locked inside. Just let us break a small window to get in. We will pay for the damage." Beatrice had spent her entire adult life using her children as a human shield to avoid accountability. She assumed the presence of cold toddlers would melt the strict enforcement of the law. She was wrong. "If you attempt to damage this property in any way, you will leave me with no choice," the lead officer warned. "You are standing outside a locked residence. You have no legal proof of tenancy. You do not have the property owner present to verify your authorized access. From a legal standpoint, you are trespassing." Sandra gasped, clutching a hand to her chest. "Are you threatening to arrest a grandmother in the rain?" "I am giving you an ultimatum," the officer countered. The rain was running in heavy streams down the brim of his uniform cap. "You have two choices tonight. You can get into your vehicle, leave the town limits, and figure out your family dispute in the morning. Or you can place your hands behind your backs, and I will process you for attempted breaking and entering." The silence that followed was sweeter than any pain medication the hospital had ever administered. Through the camera feed, I watched the reality of the situation crush their inflated egos. They had always operated under the assumption that the rules did not apply to them. They believed their shared DNA gave them a blank check to exploit my life. Standing on my wet driveway, surrounded by flashing lights, the law had finally drawn a hard, unforgiving boundary. Sandra looked around the neighborhood. The commotion had drawn an audience. The porch lights of the surrounding houses had flickered on. From my hospital bed, I could clearly see Barbara Gable standing on her wraparound porch. She held a steaming mug of tea in one hand and her smartphone in the other, documenting the entire humiliating spectacle. "Let us go," Julian muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. He lowered his hands, avoiding the blinding police lights. "Julian, our luggage is in there," Beatrice cried, her mascara running in dark streaks down her wet cheeks. "Get in the car, Beatrice," Julian snapped. His charm was gone. The facade was shattered. The walk of shame was a brutal, agonizing procession. Julian trudged toward his SUV, his expensive shoes squelching in the mud. Beatrice dragged the screaming twins across the wet asphalt, shoving them unceremoniously into the back seat of her minivan. Sandra followed closely behind, her shoulders slumped, her ruined designer bag dragging near the puddles. The police officers remained on the driveway, their hands resting near their radios, watching carefully until the engines roared to life. Julian threw his vehicle into reverse. He backed out into the street, the tires spinning on the slick pavement. As he shifted into drive, his headlights swept across the front of my house. He paused for a fraction of a second, glaring through the windshield at the dark, impenetrable fortress that had just defeated him. In that brief, frozen moment, captured by my security lens, I saw the raw, calculating rage brewing in his eyes. He realized he could not break my windows. He realized he could not charm the police. The physical assault on my property had failed. He pulled out his phone, his thumb tapping the screen with a manic intensity. He was searching for a different point of leverage. If he could not conquer my home, he was going to systematically dismantle the foundation that paid for it. He was going to attack the very source of my independence, aiming directly at my corporate career. The morning sun pierced through the horizontal blinds of my hospital window, casting rigid bars of light across the linoleum floor. It was day 5. The surgical team had just removed my intravenous line, leaving a small, throbbing bruise on the back of my hand. My physical recovery was progressing, but the digital war I waged the night before had left a lingering, electric tension in my muscles. I pushed the plastic tray holding a bowl of congealing institutional oatmeal away from my lap. I reached for my smartphone, expecting a barrage of vitriolic text messages from my brother or mother. The notification screen was surprisingly barren of family communications. Instead, a single calendar alert flashed. It was a scheduled incoming call from the Human Resources Department of my employer, Vertex Financial Technologies. The device vibrated in my palm. The caller identification displayed the name Pamela Hayes, the Senior Director of Human Resources, accompanied by Marcus Sterling, my Vice President of Risk Analytics. I cleared my throat, adjusting the angle of my hospital bed so I was sitting upright. I swiped the green icon to accept the call. Arianne, Pamela began, her tone carrying that specific, measured cadence corporate executives use when navigating a potential legal minefield. We are calling you on a recorded line. How is your recovery progressing? I am managing the pain well, Pamela, I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. I anticipate being discharged within the next 48 hours. Is there an issue with my short-term disability paperwork? There was a brief, loaded silence on the line. I heard the faint rustle of papers, likely a printed incident report. We received a highly concerning phone call this morning on the company emergency contact line, Marcus interjected. His usually booming voice was subdued, laced with caution. The caller identified himself as your brother, Julian Richard. He stated he was acting on behalf of your mother, who he claimed was your legal medical proxy. A cold knot formed in my stomach, distinct from the surgical wounds. Julian had not spent the night licking his wounds. He had spent it plotting a financial assassination. What did my brother tell you? I asked, my grip tightening on the smooth metal of the bed rail. Pamela let out a soft sigh. He reported that you suffered a severe adverse reaction to the anesthesia and the post-operative narcotics. He used the term post-surgical psychosis. He claimed you were experiencing paranoid delusions, acting erratically and exhibiting behavior that made you a danger to yourself and your family. The sheer audacity of his narrative was breathtaking. Julian was a failing real estate broker whose entire career relied on spinning desperate situations into lucrative deals. He was applying his sleazy sales tactics to my medical status. He made a formal request on behalf of your family, Marcus continued, the skepticism bleeding through his professional restraint. He asked Vertex Financial to immediately transition your status from paid short-term recovery to an indefinite, unpaid medical leave of absence. He stated you needed intensive inpatient psychiatric care and would not be capable of performing your duties for at least 6 months. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. Julian knew the exact parameters of my financial life. I had clawed my way out of student debt and secured the Milford house through relentless budgeting. My mortgage, property taxes, and home insurance required a steady, uninterrupted flow of income. If Vertex placed me on unpaid leave, I would drain my emergency savings within 2 months. By month 3, the bank would issue a foreclosure notice. Julian was trying to bankrupt me to punish me for locking him out of a free vacation. He wanted to starve me out. He assumed I was a helpless patient, incapable of defending my career from a hospital bed. Pamela, I said, leaning forward, the adrenaline overriding any lingering fatigue. Could you please open my employee file and review the emergency contact modification I submitted on Monday afternoon, precisely 24 hours before my appendix ruptured? I heard the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard on their end. A few seconds passed. I have the file open, Pamela confirmed. You submitted a digital revision. You removed Sandra Richard as your primary contact and revoked all her permissions to receive employment or health updates. You listed your neighbor, Barbara Gable, as your sole emergency liaison. Julian does not have the authority to make requests regarding my employment, I stated, my voice echoing off the sterile walls of the hospital room. Furthermore, he is fabricating the entire narrative regarding my mental health. He is attempting to sabotage my income because I refused to let him use my private residence as a party venue while I was undergoing emergency surgery. That is a very serious accusation, Arianne, Marcus noted, though I could hear the relief in his tone. We value your contributions to the analytics team, but Julian sounded incredibly distressed. He claimed you locked your nieces and nephews out in the rain during a delusional episode. He is a phenomenal actor, I replied dryly, but as a data analyst, I prefer hard evidence over emotional testimonies. I am sending an encrypted email to your secure inbox right now. Please open the attached audio files. I navigated to the cloud folder where I had stored the recordings from the previous night. I selected the series of voicemails Julian left during the twilight lockout, followed by the high-definition video clip of him preparing to hurl a concrete landscaping block through my living room window. I tapped send. I waited in silence, listening to the ambient hum of the hospital ventilation system. A minute later, the quiet gasp from Pamela told me the files had decrypted. The pristine, soundproofed environment of the Vertex boardroom was suddenly filled with the feral, unhinged screaming of my brother. His recorded voice echoed through their speakerphone, demanding access to my property, swearing profusely, and threatening to break down the door. The audio painted a vivid picture of an entitled predator throwing a tantrum, a stark contrast to the concerned sibling he had pretended to be just an hour prior. When the final audio clip ended, the silence on the line was profound. Good God, Marcus muttered, his professional restraint entirely dissolving. That man sounds deranged. Those recordings were captured last night, I explained, smoothing the edge of my hospital blanket. The local police department responded to the scene and threatened to arrest him for attempted breaking and entering. He is retaliating against me because his vacation was interrupted. He wants me to default on my mortgage. Pamela cleared her throat, her corporate instincts kicking into high gear. Arianne, I want to assure you that your employment status remains secure. Your paid medical leave is fully approved. We will not be altering your compensation based on a fraudulent phone call. Thank you, Pamela. But I need to know how the company plans to address the security breach, I countered. Julian attempted to manipulate corporate records by impersonating an authorized representative. He tried to interfere with my health benefits and my salary. Vertex Financial Technologies did not take kindly to external threats. As a firm managing sensitive analytics for major banking institutions, any attempt at social engineering or unauthorized access was treated as a severe security incident. Julian had not just attacked my personal livelihood. He had tripped the alarm of a multi-billion-dollar corporate legal department. We have a zero-tolerance policy for this tier of harassment, Marcus stated, his voice hardening into the ruthless executive persona that made him so effective. Julian utilized company channels to launch a fraudulent attack against one of my senior analysts. I am looping in the general counsel immediately. By noon that day, the counterstrike was executed. The Vertex legal team drafted a comprehensive cease and desist order. The document outlined Julian's fraudulent impersonation, his attempt to unlawfully alter corporate health directives, and his harassment of a Vertex employee. The legal notice promised swift civil litigation and potential criminal charges for fraud if he ever contacted the company or any of its representatives again. They did not just mail the letter. Vertex utilized a private courier service to hand-deliver the document directly to Julian at his boutique real estate brokerage, ensuring his receptionist, his colleagues, and his managing broker witnessed him receiving a severe legal warning from a major tech firm. His attempt to ruin my professional reputation resulted in a permanent, documented stain on his own. My phone buzzed with an email confirmation from Pamela, containing a digital copy of the delivered legal notice. I read through the dense legalese, savoring the airtight protection my company had provided. The corporate shield had deflected Julian's blade and shattered it. However, the victory was fleeting. Just as I closed the email, my attending physician walked into the room carrying a clipboard. She checked my vitals, inspected the healing incision, and offered a warm smile. "You are recovering beautifully, Arianne," the doctor announced. "We are officially clearing you for discharge this afternoon. You can finish your recovery at home." The word home sent a complicated shiver down my spine. I had successfully locked the predators out, but my sanctuary was still contaminated. Their sandy towels, their cheap chargers, their discarded luggage, and Sandra's ruined designer tote bag were all sitting inside my house. I could not simply walk through the front door and begin healing while surrounded by the physical remnants of their entitlement. Worse yet, I knew they would be hovering. They knew I would eventually have to return to the property. They would likely park down the street, waiting for me to arrive, hoping to ambush me while I was weak and carrying my hospital bags. I needed to empty the house and erase their footprint, but I could not do it while constantly looking over my shoulder. I needed a distraction. I needed a piece of bait so irresistible that their arrogance would blind them to my true intentions. I pulled my smartphone from the tray table, opening a blank text message addressed to my sister Beatrice, and began crafting the perfect trap. The orderly wheeled me through the sliding glass doors of the Yale New Haven lobby. The midday sun stung my eyes. The crisp Connecticut air filled my lungs, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled oxygen of the surgical ward. I was officially discharged on day 6. The physical pain had reduced to a dull, manageable ache, kept at bay by over-the-counter medication, and the sheer momentum of my anger. Returning to Milford presented a tactical hurdle. My family possessed a predictable playbook. They utilized intimidation through physical presence. I knew Julian and Sandra would not simply abandon their coastal vacation dreams. They were likely idling in a rented vehicle down the street from my property, waiting for the precise moment I arrived weak, clutching discharge papers, and desperate for rest. They wanted an ambush. I needed an empty battlefield. To clear the perimeter, I had to offer a piece of bait so tantalizing their legendary arrogance would blind them to the trap. I opened my messaging application and selected Beatrice's contact profile. Beatrice was the optimal target. From childhood, she thrived on the concept of victimhood and demanded constant validation. If I offered an apology, her ego would force the rest of the family to comply. I typed with deliberate, calculated precision. "Beatrice, I am so sorry. The surgical painkillers triggered a severe paranoid reaction. I was not thinking clearly. Please meet me at the Milford Diner on Route 1 at noon today. I will buy lunch, return your belongings, and give you the new smart lock access codes so you can finish your vacation in peace." The delivery notification appeared instantly. 3 pulsating dots indicated she was typing a reply. The response arrived seconds later. "We will be there. Mom says you also need to reimburse us for the motel we had to book last night. See you at noon." Hook swallowed. I hailed a rideshare service, providing an address located 3 blocks away from my actual street. During the transit, I made a phone call to a premium, discreet local moving company. I requested a 2-man rapid response crew, authorizing a double rate for immediate dispatch. The vehicle dropped me off. I walked the remaining distance, keeping to the shadows of the mature oak trees lining the sidewalk. Barbara Gable stood on her porch holding a pair of pruning shears. She offered a silent, reassuring nod. The driveway was empty. The trap was working. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of my front door. The titanium deadbolt retracted with a smooth, satisfying mechanical hum. I stepped across the threshold. The reality of their invasion hit my senses before my eyes could even adjust to the light. The air hung heavy with the odor of stale grease, spilled alcohol, and the briny scent of wet beach towels left to fester on hardwood floors. Seeing the destruction through a digital camera feed was one thing. Standing amidst the physical wreckage of my sanctuary was a profound violation. A white panel van pulled into the driveway. Two sturdy men wearing gray uniforms jogged up the front steps. I handed them a stack of thick, industrial-grade black contractor bags. If it does not look like it belongs in a minimalist coastal home, put it in the bag, I instructed, gesturing toward the living room. We swept through the property with military efficiency. The movers grabbed Beatrice's damp floral sundress, tossing it alongside Mason's sticky plastic beach toys. I directed them to the kitchen, pointing out Julian's imported gin bottles, his expensive cocktail shaker, and a tangled mess of cheap phone chargers left plugged into my island outlets. We moved to the guest bathroom, sweeping Sandra's overpriced wrinkle creams and Richard's discarded reading glasses into the dark plastic voids. Within 45 minutes, every trace of their existence was sealed inside heavy-duty polyethylene. I rode in the passenger seat of the moving van, directing the driver across the town line to a dilapidated industrial park. I had secured a rental agreement online for the cheapest, dingiest climate-controlled storage unit available in the neighboring district. The facility smelled of motor oil and damp concrete. A single flickering fluorescent bulb illuminated the narrow metal corridor. We arrived at Unit 4B. The movers hurled the black bags onto the dusty concrete floor, stacking them in a chaotic pile. I paid the facility manager for exactly 30 days of rent using a prepaid debit card. I purchased a generic brass padlock from the front office, securing the corrugated metal door myself. I pocketed the solitary silver key. My next stop was the local postal branch. I purchased a padded envelope, writing Sandra's permanent home address in stark block letters. I dropped the silver key inside, sealing the package and affixing a bright green certified mail sticker. This specific postage required a physical signature upon delivery. It provided a legally binding paper trail proving I had returned their property. They would receive their sandy towels and cheap chargers in 3 to 5 business days. I glanced at the digital clock on the postal counter. 12:30. A vivid image formed in my mind. The Richard family sitting in a sticky, cracked vinyl booth at the Milford Diner, the scent of stale fryer oil clinging to their clothes. Sandra constantly checking her watch, practicing the condescending lecture she planned to deliver upon my arrival. Julian calculating the exact dollar amount he intended to extract from me for his perceived inconvenience. Beatrice trying in vain to keep her sugar-fueled twins from dismantling the condiment caddy. The waitress circling their table, growing increasingly impatient, asking if they were ready to order or if they were going to continue taking up valuable seating. The slow, agonizing realization sinking into their bones. The wealthy, compliant sister they planned to extort was not walking through those diner doors. They had been stood up. I returned to my quiet, sanitized home. The moving van departed. I stood in the center of my living room. The white linen sofa still bore the red stains, and the Persian rug was still ruined. But the space was mine again. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of their entitlement had been bagged and exiled to a dusty metal box miles away. Exhaustion began to settle over my healing body. I decided to send an update to my management team regarding my discharge status. I walked down the hallway and pushed open the door to my home office. I sat in my ergonomic chair and pressed the power button on my workstation. As the monitors booted up, casting a cool blue glow across the room, a flash of color near the floorboard caught my eye. Pushed deep under the mahogany desk, hidden in the shadows, sat a familiar object. Sandra's counterfeit leather tote bag. She must have dropped it during the frantic scramble of the twilight lockout. I reached down and pulled it onto my lap. The golden zipper was stuck halfway open. I tipped the bag over, expecting to find nothing more than expired coupons and half-empty tubes of lipstick. Instead, a heavy metallic object tumbled out, striking the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter. I looked down. A small, pink, encrypted flash drive attached to a heavy brass keychain lay at my feet. My data analyst instincts flared to life. I reached for the drive, entirely unaware that the digital secrets hidden inside were about to reduce my family dynamic to ash. The cold brass keychain rested in my palm, heavy and full of unasked questions. Before I could slide the pink storage device into my workstation port, a rapid succession of chimes erupted from my smartphone on the edge of the desk. The local community's social media group notifications flooded my lock screen. I swiped upward, bypassing the security prompt. Beatrice had wasted zero time weaponizing her humiliation from the diner trap. She posted a lengthy, tear-stained paragraph accompanied by a tragic photograph of her children sitting on a damp curb from the night before. The caption painted a vivid, fabricated horror story designed to trigger maximum public outrage. She described me as a heartless, wealthy spinster living in a coastal mansion, a woman who ruthlessly forced her destitute sister and innocent toddlers onto the dangerous streets without a second thought. Sandra chimed in through the comments section, validating every lie, expressing deep maternal grief over my supposed descent into greed and paranoia. Julian shared the post to his own network, adding a warning about the dangers of extreme isolation. They relied on social pressure to force compliance. They expected the public shame to break my resolve, assuming I would beg for forgiveness to save my reputation in the affluent Milford community. My phone buzzed again with a direct message from an unfamiliar neighbor, offering me prayers and suggesting I seek immediate psychiatric help. I did not reply. I toggled the device into silent mode and tossed it onto a stack of unsorted mail. The digital mudslinging meant nothing. It was a classic extinction burst. The frantic flailing of predators realizing their prey had finally escaped the trap. My attention shifted back to the physical reality of my home office, specifically to the counterfeit designer tote sitting on the hardwood floorboards. The placement was too deliberate. My workspace was tucked away at the far end of the hallway, an isolated room far from the kitchen, the living area, or the guest bathroom. There was no legitimate reason for my mother to bring her personal belongings into this specific sanctuary. I surveyed the space, my data analyst instincts scanning for anomalies. The bottom drawer of my metal filing cabinet sat slightly ajar. A single manila folder containing old tax documents peeked out from the hanging racks, the paper slightly crumpled. The realization crystallized, sharp and undeniable. Sandra had not just wandered in here by accident to admire the view. She had been actively hunting. She spent her stolen vacation digging through my private financial records, searching for my tax returns, my bank statements, and my investment portfolios. She needed concrete numbers. The family always viewed my income as a communal emergency fund, but they never knew the exact figures. Sandra wanted to calculate my true net worth to determine exactly how much she could demand for Julian's next failing venture or Beatrice's incoming credit card bills. When the smart lock engaged the night before, trapping them outside, she panicked. She dropped the bag and fled the room before she could secure her stolen intelligence. I dragged the heavy bag onto my lap, ignoring the dull throb near my surgical incision. I turned the faux leather interior inside out. A cascade of items spilled across my pristine mahogany desk. Several tubes of expensive lipstick clattered against a compact mirror. A crumpled handful of receipts drifted down like fallen snow, settling near my keyboard. I picked up a long white strip of thermal paper. It detailed a recent transaction at a luxury seafood restaurant downtown. $240 for lobster tails, oysters, and top-shelf martinis. I grabbed another receipt, this one from a high-end children's boutique located in a wealthy suburban mall. $400 for silk dresses and imported leather shoes for the twins. The hypocrisy burned bright against the backdrop of their online smear campaign. They presented themselves to the world as struggling victims, demanding I subsidize their basic existence. Yet they dined on delicacies and clothed their children in designer fabric. The narrative of crippling poverty was a carefully constructed illusion. a tool designed specifically to manipulate my empathy and drain my resources. My gaze drifted past the cosmetics and the damning receipts, landing squarely on the small pink flash drive resting near the edge of the desk. The device felt dense, heavier than a standard commercial storage stick. I ran my thumb over the casing. It featured a ruggedized exterior and a distinct logo indicating military-grade hardware encryption. A profound discrepancy struck me. Sandra struggled to operate the basic functions of a smart television. She regularly called me in a panic to reset her email passwords because she kept locking herself out of her own accounts. She possessed zero technical literacy. There was no logical reason for a woman who typed with one finger to carry a highly secure, encrypted data storage device on her keychain, unless someone else configured it for her, or unless she was hiding documents so sensitive that standard cloud storage felt far too vulnerable. A familiar thrill washed over my healing body, replacing the fatigue of the hospital stay. My entire professional life revolved around extracting truth from hidden numbers. I thrived on dismantling digital fortifications and revealing the raw data underneath. I slid my ergonomic chair closer to the dual monitors. I did not plug the drive directly into my primary operating system. Doing so could risk exposing my network to automated malware or tracking scripts. Instead, I booted up a secure, isolated sandbox environment on my secondary laptop. This virtual machine had no connection to the broader internet and would contain any potential digital threats within a closed loop. I inserted the pink drive into the USB port. A soft chime indicated a successful hardware connection. The screen flashed black for a fraction of a second. A sleek, gray dialog box materialized in the center of the display. Enter passcode. 10 attempts remaining. I stared at the blinking cursor. A cryptographic wall stood between me and whatever secrets Sandra deemed valuable enough to lock away. A brute force software attack could take days, but I possessed a far more efficient tool. I knew the human element. I knew the psychology of the woman who set the lock. People with narcissistic tendencies rarely choose abstract passwords. They choose terms that reinforce their own worldview, validating their ego. Sandra would never use my birthday. She viewed me as an afterthought. She would not use a random string of generated numbers because she would instantly forget them. I typed the first attempt, Beatrice's birth date, followed by Julian's birth year. I hit the return key. Access denied. 9 attempts remaining. I rested my chin on my hand, thinking back to the receipts scattered on my desk, the designer knockoff bag, the constant need to project wealth and status. Sandra worshipped the image of a perfect family hierarchy. She worshipped the son she believed would one day make her rich. I typed Julian's middle name, followed by the year he started his boutique real estate firm. Access denied. 8 attempts remaining. The sting of failure sharpened my focus. I needed to think smaller, more personal. What was the core truth of her identity? She was a mother who sacrificed everything for her golden children, while ignoring the daughter who actually achieved success. But deep down, her primary loyalty was always to her own financial security. I looked at the tax folder peeking out from my cabinet. I remembered a conversation from years ago, right after my paternal grandmother passed away. Sandra had been obsessed with the estate, constantly talking about securing the family legacy. I positioned my fingers over the keyboard. I typed the name of my late grandmother, followed by the word legacy and a $sign. I pressed enter. The gray dialog box vanished. A green loading bar raced across the screen, reaching 100% in a matter of seconds. The secure partition unlocked, displaying a root directory filled with neatly organized folders. I clicked on the first folder, my heart hammering a harsh rhythm against my ribs. The digital curtain was rising, and the pristine illusion of the Richard family was about to burn to the ground. The green loading bar vanished from my secondary monitor. A crisp, white File Explorer window replaced the gray security prompt. A grid of meticulously organized yellow folder icons populated the display. Sandra lacked the technical prowess to configure military-grade encryption, but she possessed the calculating, meticulous nature of a seasoned grifter. The directory structure was terrifying in its precise categorization. I clicked on the first icon located in the upper left corner, a folder designated with the simple title of Liabilities. Inside sat dozens of nested directories, each labeled by year. I opened the oldest file, tracing the dates back exactly 11 years. The screen populated with high-resolution scanned documents. I clicked the top portable document format file. It was an application for a regional utility company servicing an apartment complex I had never visited. I zoomed in on the applicant information. My heart performed a slow, painful rhythm against my ribs. The printed name on the header was Arianne Richard. The Social Security number listed just below it was my own. The date of birth confirmed my identity, but the signature at the bottom of the page was a practiced, elegant forgery of my handwriting. I checked the timestamp on the application. It was dated precisely 2 days after my 18th birthday, the exact moment I became a legal adult in the eyes of the government. My parents began mining my identity as an exploitable resource. I clicked through the subsequent files, my jaw clenching so tight my teeth ached. There were records of short-term payday advances, high-interest department store credit cards, and municipal utility accounts. I remembered the notification I saw on my banking application while lying in the hospital ward. That 5-point drop in my credit score was not a random algorithmic fluctuation. It was the direct result of their ongoing financial manipulation. They were opening small lines of revolving credit under my name, maxing out the balances to subsidize their lavish lifestyle. They would intentionally ignore the billing statements, letting the accounts slip into delinquency just long enough to trigger a penalty on my credit profile. Right before the debt went into severe collections, they would pay the minimum balance to avoid legal action. This strategic defaulting allowed Sandra and Richard to preserve their own pristine credit scores. They utilized my personal identifying information as a disposable shield to absorb the impact of their reckless spending. A wave of nausea washed over me, distinct from the lingering effects of the surgical anesthesia. I thought back to the year I signed the lease for my first cramped studio apartment in Stamford. The property manager had demanded a secondary guarantor, citing a mysterious, persistent blemish on my credit history. I was humiliated. I had worked tirelessly, yet I seemed mathematically incapable of building a secure foundation. Sandra graciously offered to co-sign the rental agreement, playing the role of the supportive, generous matriarch rescuing her struggling daughter. The realization tasted like copper on my tongue. She was the arsonist, selling me a fire extinguisher. I closed the liabilities directory and navigated back to the root menu. My cursor hovered over a secure subfolder locked beneath a secondary tier of organization. The label read A.R. Trust. My initials. My fingers hovered over the mouse. A deep, instinctual dread pooled in my stomach. I double-clicked the icon. A series of scanned legal instruments filled the display. The letterhead at the top of the primary document belonged to a highly prominent estate attorney based in Hartford. I opened the master file. The cursive signature of my late paternal grandmother sat at the bottom of the final page, executed in blue ink and stamped by a certified notary public. The legal text outlined the establishment of a dedicated education fund, $30,000 earmarked exclusively for my university tuition and living expenses. My grandmother passed away when I was a teenager. She was a quiet, observant woman who had clearly recognized the glaring disparity in our household dynamic. She witnessed Sandra and Richard pouring every available resource into Julian and Beatrice. In a final, profound act of love, my grandmother attempted to level the playing field. She built a financial safety net designed to protect my future. I opened the corresponding accounting spreadsheets stored next to the legal charter. The withdrawal dates painted a ruthless, chronological map of betrayal. My parents were designated as the fiduciary guardians of the account until I reached the age of 21. They did not wait for my college acceptance letters. $8,000 transferred out of the secure holding account a mere month before Beatrice walked down the aisle. I cross-referenced the date with the memories of her extravagant wedding reception. That exact sum corresponded perfectly with the deposit required for her imported floral arrangements and custom ice sculptures. Beatrice celebrated her matrimonial bliss, funded entirely by my stolen tuition. I scanned down to the next major deduction: $12,000 wired to a newly established limited liability company. The registered owner of that shell corporation was Julian Richard. He requested the capital during his disastrous attempt to launch a luxury lifestyle mobile application that never even reached the development phase. My brother played the role of a visionary tech entrepreneur, using the stolen inheritance meant to secure my education. The final $10,000 vanished in a series of rapid cash withdrawals. During the autumn, I began applying for financial aid. My chest tightened, constricting the airflow to my lungs. I felt the phantom weight of the heavy canvas backpack I carried across a freezing campus. I remembered working 3 consecutive minimum wage jobs just to afford secondhand textbooks. I recalled the crippling anxiety attacks, the sleepless nights calculating exponential interest rates on my federal loans, and the crushing burden of debt that dictated every single choice I made during my 20s. They watched me struggle. They sat across from me at holiday dinners, listening to me worry about making rent, knowing full well they had stolen the exact resource designed to prevent my suffering. They had not just favored my siblings, they actively cannibalized my future to fund their present luxury. The profound sense of violation bypassed typical human grief. The emotion did not burn hot or loud. It froze into a glacial, calculating calm. The tears I might have shed evaporated before they could even form. Sandra and Richard were no longer merely toxic parents or entitled house guests overstaying their welcome. By forging my signature on utility applications and funneling trust distributions into their personal checking accounts across state lines, they crossed a definitive legal boundary. Under the strict statutes of Connecticut law, my mother and father were felons. They committed severe identity theft, breached fiduciary duties, and engaged in federal wire fraud. The pink storage drive resting in my laptop port was not just a collection of secrets. It was a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. I began the slow, methodical process of transferring the incriminating files onto an external, encrypted server located outside my home network. I needed an airtight dossier, protected from any potential physical retaliation or hardware failure. The progress bar crawled across the screen, calculating the transfer time for a decade of financial crimes. While the data migrated, I decided to occupy my restless mind. I needed to verify the insurance claim parameters for my ruined living room furniture. I launched the security application interface on my primary monitor, opening the archive of high-definition patio footage I had captured the night before. I planned to quickly review the timestamp where Julian swept my prescription medication into the garbage. I dragged the playback slider across the timeline. The video fast-forwarded, showing the afternoon sun shifting across the hardwood floors. I hit the play button, preparing to take a screenshot of the damaged property. But as the video played at normal speed, a glaring anomaly caught my eye, something I had entirely missed while my mind was clouded by surgical narcotics and physical exhaustion. Julian was not just standing in my kitchen drinking expensive gin. He was adjusting the collar of a tailored navy blazer. He walked toward my front entryway, out of the frame of the living room camera. I switched the feed to the doorbell lens. Julian pulled the heavy mahogany door open. He offered a practiced, charismatic smile to a well-dressed couple standing on my porch. He shook their hands warmly and gestured for them to step inside my private residence. The implications of his wardrobe and his confident demeanor hit me with the force of a physical blow, introducing a twisted new variable into the equation. The data migration of the fraudulent trust fund ledgers crawled across my secondary monitor, a slow progression of digital evidence transferring into my secure offshore cloud server. While the files copied, my mind needed a temporary detour from the profound horror of my stolen identity. I still had an immediate practical problem to solve regarding the physical destruction of my property. My homeowner's insurance policy required comprehensive documentation to process a claim for the ruined white linen sofa and the grease-stained Persian rug. I pivoted my ergonomic chair toward the primary screen, maximizing the security application interface. I opened the archive of high-definition indoor patio footage, intending to capture pristine screenshots of the exact moments Beatrice's toddlers smeared their cherry popsicles into my upholstery. I dragged the playback cursor backward along the timeline, bypassing the chaotic twilight lockout and the police encounter. I settled the marker on Tuesday afternoon, day 2 of their uninvited residency. I pressed play, expecting to scrub through hours of noisy children and Sandra complaining about the television remote. Instead, the interior of my home was eerily quiet. The living room was spotless. The scattered toys were hidden away. The damp towels were absent from the backs of the dining chairs. Beatrice and her screaming twins were nowhere to be seen. Sandra was missing from her usual perch on the accent chair. Julian occupied the frame alone, but he looked entirely different. He wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp, pressed white button-down shirt. His imported leather shoes gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. He held a microfiber cloth, meticulously wiping away a smudge on the marble surface of my kitchen island. He adjusted the placement of a decorative bowl and straightened the throw pillows on the sofa, concealing the fresh stains beneath a folded cashmere blanket. My brow furrowed. Julian had never voluntarily cleaned a surface in his entire life. During our childhood, Sandra followed him from room to room, picking up his discarded clothing and washing his dishes, claiming his future genius required an environment free of mundane chores. Seeing him perform manual labor in my house triggered a sharp, immediate warning signal in my brain. The doorbell chime echoed through the audio feed. Julian tossed the microfiber cloth into a hidden drawer. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, plastering a practiced, brilliant smile across his face. He walked toward the front entryway with the confident stride of a seasoned executive. I switched the camera view to the exterior porch lens. A sleek, black, luxury sedan idled in my driveway. A well-dressed couple stood on my welcome mat. They radiated quiet, understated wealth. The man wore a lightweight merino wool sweater draped casually over his shoulders. The woman carried a structured leather handbag that cost more than my first car. They were quintessential Manhattanites, the type of affluent city dwellers who fled the sweltering concrete jungle every summer for the breezy coastal towns of Connecticut. Julian opened the heavy mahogany door. He extended his hand, greeting the man with a firm, masculine shake, followed by a polite nod to the woman. He gestured grandly, inviting the strangers across my threshold. I switched the feed back to the interior living room camera and boosted the audio gain to maximum capacity. The sensitive hidden microphones picked up every syllable of their conversation. "Welcome to my coastal retreat," Julian announced, his voice smooth as polished glass. "The acoustics in here are fantastic, do you not agree?" The couple stepped into the sunlit space, their eyes scanning the vaulted ceilings and the panoramic view of the Long Island Sound crashing against the shoreline outside the window. The woman murmured a soft sound of approval, stepping closer to the glass to admire the cedar deck I had stained with my own blistered hands. "It is a beautiful property, Julian," the husband remarked, inspecting the custom millwork around the fireplace. "You mentioned you renovated it yourself." "Yes, it was quite the passion project," Julian lied without a fraction of a second of hesitation. "I purchased it as a distressed foreclosure a few years ago. The bones were incredible, but it needed a visionary touch. I did most of the labor on the weekends to ensure the craftsmanship met my standards. It serves as my secondary property, a quiet place to escape the demands of the city." A cold, heavy dread settled into my chest. He was not just stealing my wine or using my utilities. He was stealing my narrative. He took the grueling years of my financial sacrifice, the late nights scraping wallpaper, the bruised knuckles from installing hardwood floors, and packaged it all into a charming anecdote to inflate his own ego. The couple continued their tour, drifting into the custom kitchen. Julian pointed out the high-end appliances and the imported tile backsplash, features I had researched and budgeted for over 12 agonizing months. He spoke with the fluid grace of a licensed real estate broker, highlighting the investment value and the proximity to the private beach access. "We are very interested," the husband finally said, leaning against the marble island. "We have looked at several summer rentals in Greenwich and Westport, but the inventory is lacking privacy. We need a place from June through the end of August." "What kind of lease terms are you proposing for this property?" Julian offered a conspiratorial smile, lowering his voice to a hushed, exclusive register. "I am going to be entirely transparent with you," Julian began, placing his hands flat on the countertop. "My brokerage firm handles hundreds of high-profile leases, but I prefer to keep my personal properties off the official market. It avoids the bureaucratic red tape and maintains a certain level of discretion for my prominent clients. I am willing to offer you the house for $15,000 a month, cash only, no formal background checks, no intrusive digital footprints, just a private arrangement between peers." The plot twist hit me with the kinetic force of a freight train. My lungs seized, the oxygen vanished from the room. Julian was not just mooching a free beach vacation, he was actively attempting to illegally sublet my multi-million-dollar coastal home to wealthy strangers. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together, forming a horrifying picture of desperation and greed. Julian's boutique real estate firm was failing. The stolen trust fund money from our grandmother was long gone, squandered on his terrible business acumen. He likely owed substantial sums to dangerous creditors, or his gambling habits had finally drained his secret accounts. He needed a massive, untraceable influx of capital, and he needed it immediately. He orchestrated the entire family vacation as a calculated smokescreen. He convinced Sandra and Beatrice to pack their bags, knowing their presence would justify his access to my property. Once inside, he sent them away for the afternoon, staging the house to look like his own personal investment asset. He intended to hand the keys to my sanctuary over to complete strangers, pocket $45,000 in untaxed cash, and vanish. The sheer liability of his scheme was staggering. He planned to leave me with unknown tenants occupying my primary residence. What if they threw destructive parties? What if they refused to vacate the premises at the end of the summer, forcing me into a nightmare eviction process that could take a year to resolve in the Connecticut housing courts? What if I had come home from the hospital early, weak and recovering, only to walk into my living room and find a strange man sleeping on my sofa? Julian did not care about the legal or physical danger he was thrusting upon me. He only cared about saving his own pristine image. I paused the video feed. My hands were shaking, trembling with a fierce, directed energy. I minimized the security application and pivoted back to the pink encrypted flash drive directory. If Julian was running a sophisticated cash fraud scheme, he would need basic paperwork to make the transaction appear legitimate to the wealthy Manhattan couple. He would not just hand over a key on a verbal promise. I utilized the search function within the root directory of Sandra's stolen drive. I typed the keyword lease. A single portable document format file materialized in the search results, modified just 3 days prior. I clicked the icon. A drafted residential rental agreement opened on my screen. It was formatted on the official letterhead of Julian's boutique real estate brokerage. The property address listed was my Milford home. The designated landlord and authorized owner was typed clearly as Julian Richard. He had forged the legal documentation. He was a licensed real estate professional utilizing his corporate credentials to execute a fraudulent subletting ring using a stolen property. This was not just a violation of the familial code. This was a severe, career-ending violation of the Connecticut Real Estate Commission ethical guidelines, a felony fraud attempt, and a massive breach of state commerce laws. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the compiled mountain of evidence illuminating my monitors. The forged utility bills from my 18th birthday, the drained trust fund accounting ledgers, the high-definition video of the illegal property showing, the fraudulent corporate lease agreement. The Richard family thought they were dealing with a compliant, exhausted patient. They relied on the archaic dynamic where the successful daughter silently absorbed the collateral damage of their chaotic lives. They forgot they were dealing with a senior risk analyst who spent her entire professional career synthesizing complex data sets to destroy corporate liabilities. I picked up my smartphone from the desk. I did not dial the local police precinct. A patrol officer could only write a trespassing report. I needed a weapon far more devastating. I needed someone who specialized in financial execution. I opened my browser and began searching the registry for the most ruthless corporate litigator in the state of Connecticut. The name Vance Sterling carried a terrifying reputation in the legal circles of Fairfield County. He was a senior partner at a firm specializing in high net worth asset recovery and complex corporate fraud. He did not handle messy family emotional disputes or negotiate gentle settlements. He was an apex predator in a tailored suit, known for freezing assets and bankrupting adversaries before they even realized they were in a courtroom. I did not want a mediator to facilitate a tearful reconciliation. I wanted an executioner. I scheduled an emergency consultation via secure video link. Sitting in my home office, still wearing my hospital recovery clothes, I laid out the meticulously organized digital dossier. I shared my screen, presenting the forged utility applications bearing my stolen Social Security number. I displayed the trust fund accounting spreadsheets detailing the exact dates Sandra and Richard siphoned my grandmother's legacy to fund Beatrice's wedding and Julian's shell corporation. Finally, I played the high-definition patio footage of Julian illegally showing my property, followed by the forged residential lease agreement bearing his corporate letterhead. Vance Sterling watched the presentation with a predatory stillness. When the final video clip ended, he leaned forward, adjusting his expensive reading glasses. "This is not a family dispute, Miss Richard," Vance stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "This is a multi-count federal wire fraud, identity theft, and severe breach of fiduciary duty case. The documentation you extracted from that flash drive provides an airtight paper trail. We do not need to send a polite demand letter. We are going to drop a financial nuclear bomb." Within 72 hours, the legal machinery engaged. Vance filed a massive civil suit in the Connecticut Superior Court. However, the true devastating blow was the immediate ex parte motion he filed alongside it. Utilizing the overwhelming evidence of ongoing fraud and the imminent risk of Julian continuing his illegal subletting scheme, a judge signed an emergency injunction. The court order initiated a sweeping asset freeze. It targeted the joint checking accounts belonging to Sandra and Richard. It locked down Julian's personal savings and business operating accounts. It suspended their credit cards and halted all outbound wire transfers. The financial oxygen supply to the Richard family was instantly and severely cut off. The psychological standoff that followed was a masterclass in swift, clinical retribution. The first domino fell on a Thursday morning. Sandra stood at the checkout counter of a luxury grocery store in Greenwich, her cart overflowing with premium organic produce and imported cheeses. She swiped her platinum credit card with her usual air of detached superiority. The machine beeped, flashing a bright red error message. Declined. Assuming a minor banking glitch, she produced a secondary debit card. Declined. The cashier, a young high school student, politely asked for an alternative form of payment, while the line of wealthy patrons behind her grew increasingly impatient. Sandra abandoned the cart, her face burning with humiliation, and fled the store. Julian experienced the impact during a power lunch with prospective clients at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Stamford. When the bill arrived, he confidently slapped his corporate card onto the leather folio. The waiter returned moments later, leaning down to whisper that the card issuer had flagged the account and frozen the funds. Julian, the man who built his entire persona on projecting effortless wealth, was forced to excuse himself to the restroom to frantically call his bank, only to be informed that his accounts were under a court-ordered hold pending a fraud investigation. They did not understand the origin of the attack. They assumed they were victims of identity theft or a catastrophic banking error. They spent 24 hours trapped in a confusing, terrifying limbo, unable to purchase gasoline, pay utility bills, or access cash. The true nature of their predicament arrived via certified courier on Friday afternoon. The thick manila envelopes contained the formal civil summons, detailing the exact nature of the lawsuit, the asset freeze, and the mountain of evidence attached as exhibits. My smartphone began to vibrate relentlessly. The caller identification displayed Richard's name, my father, a man who had spent my entire life communicating through passive-aggressive sighs and delegating all parental duties to Sandra. I watched the screen glow, the device vibrating against the mahogany desk in my office. I let it ring 5 times before I swiped to accept the call. "Arianne," Richard gasped. His voice was entirely stripped of its usual aloof arrogance. It sounded thin, ragged, and steeped in raw panic. "Hello, Richard," I replied, my tone flat, calm, and perfectly modulated. "You have to call your lawyers right now and stop this," he demanded, his breath hitching. "The bank just rejected our mortgage auto-pay. My credit cards are locked. Julian cannot access his business funds to pay his office lease. We are completely paralyzed. They are treating us like criminals. Under the statutes of Connecticut state law regarding identity theft and wire fraud, that is an accurate classification," I noted, pulling up the digital copy of the court injunction on my monitor. "Arianne, please," Richard begged, the desperation cracking his voice. "You cannot do this to your own blood. We are your family. If this freeze lasts another week, we will default on the house. Julian will lose his brokerage. You are going to make us lose everything over a misunderstanding." I stared out the window of my home office, watching a pair of seagulls circle the gray waters of the Long Island Sound. The physical ache of my surgical incisions was fading, replaced by the profound, bracing clarity of absolute detachment. "You drained my education fund to buy ice sculptures for Beatrice and fund a fake tech startup for Julian," I stated, speaking the truth aloud for the first time. "You forged my signature to open utility accounts when I was a teenager, intentionally defaulting on them to protect your own credit score while ruining my ability to rent an apartment." "That was a long time ago," Richard stammered, scrambling for an excuse. "We were struggling. We planned to pay you back." I ignored his pathetic rationalization. "Julian attempted to illegally sublet my primary residence to strangers while I was bleeding in a hospital bed, hoping to pocket $15,000 to cover his gambling debts. You did not view me as a daughter. You viewed my identity as a disposable asset." "Arianne, you have a good job," he pleaded, shifting tactics to appeal to my supposed obligation as the successful child. "You have this beautiful house. You do not need that old trust fund money now. We need access to our accounts to survive." "Consider the frozen assets an involuntary family sacrifice," I replied, echoing the exact sentiment Sandra used to justify locking me out of my own life. You know how much you guys love those. I pressed the red icon, terminating the call. I immediately navigated to his contact profile and selected Block Caller. I repeated the process for Sandra, Julian, and Beatrice. The communication lines were permanently severed. The predator had finally become the prey, caught in a steel trap constructed entirely from their own fraudulent data. They were suffocating under the weight of the legal system, stripped of their financial resources, and isolated from their favorite target. However, freezing their checking accounts was merely the opening salvo. I had neutralized my parents' ability to fund their lifestyle, but Julian remained a dangerous, unpredictable variable. He still possessed his real estate license, giving him a dangerous aura of professional legitimacy. He had tried to weaponize my corporate career to force me into foreclosure. It was time to return the favor and demonstrate exactly what a professional demolition looked like. The silence following the severed phone call with Richard was profound. For the first time in 29 years, the relentless static of family obligation was gone. The emotional blackmail, the subtle guilt trips, and the outright demands had been muted by the cold, unforgiving mechanism of a federal court injunction. I sat in the center of my Milford home, the evening sun casting long, golden shadows across the hardwood floors. The surgical pain was almost entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, focused energy. My parents were effectively neutralized, trapped in a financial vacuum of their own making. However, the board was not entirely clear. Julian remained. My brother possessed a unique, destructive resilience. Sandra and Richard relied on brute force manipulation, but Julian was a chameleon. He had spent his entire life charming his way out of consequences, utilizing his tailored suits and practiced smile to convince the world he was a victim of circumstance. He still possessed his real estate license, which functioned as a shield of professional legitimacy. He had weaponized his corporate persona to attack my livelihood at Vertex Financial Technologies. If I left him with his credentials intact, he would eventually find another affluent victim, spin a new fabricated narrative, and claw his way back to a position where he could retaliate. It was time to initiate the professional demolition. I did not need to fabricate an elaborate trap. Julian had handed me the execution warrant on a silver platter. I accessed my secure cloud server, opening the specific directory titled Evidence, Sublet, Fraud. I compiled the raw data into a chronological, undeniable narrative. The centerpiece was the high-definition video from Tuesday afternoon. The pristine audio captured Julian explicitly claiming ownership of my distressed foreclosure, offering a fraudulent lease to the Manhattan couple for $15,000 in untraceable cash. I paired this footage with a certified copy of my property deed, proving his claim of ownership was a blatant, calculated lie. The finishing touch was the digital document I extracted from Sandra's pink flash drive, the drafted residential rental agreement formatted on the official letterhead of his boutique real estate firm, listed Julian Richard as the authorized landlord. It was the smoking gun of a premeditated cash fraud scheme. I did not utilize Vance Sterling for this particular maneuver. Filing a complaint with the state regulatory board required a different kind of precision. I drafted a formal, heavily documented email. I addressed it simultaneously to the Ethics and Enforcement Division of the Connecticut Real Estate Commission and the managing broker of Julian's luxury firm in Westport. The subject line was sterile and clinical. Formal complaint regarding severe ethical violations, misrepresentation of ownership, and attempted cash fraud by licensed agent Julian Richard. I attached the video file, the forged lease, and my property deed. I hit send at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. The corporate fallout was not just swift, it was a localized earthquake. Boutique real estate firms operating in affluent coastal Connecticut towns survive entirely on reputation. They cater to high-net-worth individuals who demand absolute discretion and unimpeachable integrity. The managing broker of Julian's firm was a ruthless pragmatist. When he opened his inbox and viewed high-definition footage of his agent utilizing the firm's letterhead to execute an illegal, untaxed subletting ring, the response was immediate. At 10:15 that morning, Julian was summoned to the primary conference room. According to a mutual acquaintance in the industry who gleefully relayed the details later, Julian walked in expecting a discussion about upcoming quarterly targets. Instead, he found the managing broker sitting beside the firm's in-house legal counsel. The video I submitted was already queued up on the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. They did not ask for an explanation. They did not offer him the grace of a quiet resignation. Julian was terminated with extreme prejudice, effective immediately, for gross misconduct and actions detrimental to the firm's brand. The security personnel escorted him to his desk, provided him with a single cardboard box for his personal items, and marched him out the front door into the sweltering July heat, stripping him of his corporate access badges and his professional identity in front of his entire sales team. But the termination was merely the initial impact. The true devastation arrived from the state regulatory level. The Connecticut Real Estate Commission treats fraud with absolute severity. Attempting to lease a property without the verified consent of the actual owner, coupled with a demand for off-the-books cash transactions, represents a catastrophic violation of the mandated Code of Ethics. 2 weeks after the email was sent, the Commission initiated a formal disciplinary hearing. Julian attempted to retain legal counsel, but with his bank accounts frozen by Vance Sterling's injunction, no reputable attorney would take his case on contingency. He was forced to represent himself, a failing real estate broker arguing against a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence. The ruling was handed down before the end of the month. The Commission did not just issue a temporary suspension or a heavy financial fine. They formally and permanently revoked his real estate license, banning him from practicing any form of property transaction within the state of Connecticut. His name was added to the Public Registry of Disciplined Agents, a permanent digital scarlet letter ensuring he could never rebuild his career in any adjacent financial sector. He had tried to use my home to dig himself out of a financial grave. Instead, he had handed me the shovel, and I buried his entire professional future. The psychological toll on Julian was absolute. His tailored suits and imported cologne could no longer mask the reality of his situation. He was unemployed, legally barred from his chosen profession, and drowning under the weight of the civil fraud lawsuit. He had moved out of his expensive downtown apartment, unable to make the rent payments with his frozen assets, and was forced to crash on the sofa in Beatrice's cramped, chaotic apartment. The invincible golden child had been reduced to a disgraced squatter. The board was finally clear. The threats had been systematically dismantled. My career was secure, my property was empty, and the predators were caged. I sat on my pristine white linen sofa staring out at the Long Island Sound. The water was calm, reflecting the brilliant blue of the late summer sky. The silence in the house was no longer heavy or tense. It was a light, breathable peace. However, the legal machinery I set in motion with Vance Sterling was still churning toward its inevitable conclusion. Freezing the assets was the tactical maneuver to stop the bleeding, but the civil suit demanded actual restitution. Sandra and Richard had stolen $30,000 from my grandmother's trust fund, forged my identity, and caused extensive property damage. They needed to pay the piper. And with their liquid cash locked in a judicial freeze, there was only one remaining asset valuable enough to cover the massive settlement and the mounting legal fees. It was time to execute the final, devastating payoff. The conference room at Vance Sterling's law firm occupied the top floor of a sleek high-rise in downtown Stamford. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Long Island Sound. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady note, keeping the environment crisp and clinical. I sat beside my attorney at a vast mahogany table, a fresh glass of iced water resting near my fingertips. The heavy glass doors swung open. Sandra and Richard walked into the room, flanked by a frantic-looking defense attorney they had managed to secure on a strict retainer. The physical transformation of my parents was staggering. Just a month prior, they had stood on my coastal driveway, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth and entitled superiority. Today, they looked fragile and worn. The relentless stress of the judicial asset freeze had eroded their pristine suburban facade. Richard wore a suit that hung loosely on his frame, his posture slumped and defeated. Sandra carried a generic canvas bag instead of her usual designer leather tote. Her hair lacked its customary salon styling, and her eyes darted nervously around the intimidating corporate space. They took their seats across the polished wood, refusing to meet my gaze. Vance Sterling did not waste time offering pleasantries. He opened a thick manila folder and slid a single sheet of heavy stock paper across the table. It was the formal, out-of-court settlement agreement. The document outlined the exact cost of their freedom. The required sum was devastating. It included the original $30,000 stolen from my grandmother's education trust, adjusted for a decade of compound interest. It demanded statutory financial damages for the years of identity theft and unauthorized utility accounts. Finally, it included the precise invoice for the destruction of my custom linen sofa and the imported Persian rug. Richard stared at the bottom line. The color drained entirely from his face. His hands began to shake, rattling the paper against the hard surface of the table. "We do not have this kind of liquidity," Richard whispered, his voice cracking under the sheer weight of the printed numbers. "Our checking accounts are locked. Our credit lines are suspended." "You are asking for a small fortune." Vance Sterling folded his hands, his expression devoid of empathy. "You have extensive equity in your primary residence, Mr. Richard. The terms are non-negotiable. You will produce the full settlement amount within 45 days. If the funds do not clear our escrow account by that deadline, I will personally walk the encrypted flash drive of your forged financial documents over to the United States Attorney for the District of Connecticut." The defense attorney leaned in, whispering urgently into Sandra's ear. He was advising them to accept the deal. He knew the alternative was a protracted federal wire fraud trial ending in a mandatory prison sentence. Sandra finally lifted her head, her eyes brimming with a mixture of terror and profound resentment. She looked directly at me. "We will have to sell the house," Sandra said, her voice hollow and trembling. "The Colonial, the home where you grew up. We will have to list it immediately to meet your deadline. Where are we supposed to live, Arianne?" I met her stare with icy, unblinking composure. I recalled the cramped, drafty bedroom at the end of the hallway where they had relegated me for 18 years. I remembered listening to the sounds of Julian enjoying the sprawling master suite they had renovated specifically for his comfort. That sprawling 4-bedroom estate was never my home. It was a monument to their favoritism. "That sounds like a personal logistical challenge, Sandra," I replied smoothly. "I highly recommend consulting local rental listings." Their defense attorney produced a premium fountain pen. Richard signed the binding settlement first, his signature jagged and uneven. Sandra followed, a single tear spilling onto the crisp parchment. The predator had officially surrendered. The real estate market in their affluent suburban zip code moved at a rapid pace, but buyers were incredibly savvy. They recognized the scent of desperation. Because Vance Sterling had imposed a strict 45-day deadline, Sandra and Richard could not afford to wait for the perfect premium offer. They listed their pristine, manicured property at a price nearly 15% under current market value, hoping to trigger a swift bidding war and an expedited closing timeline. They needed cash, and they needed it immediately. I returned to my home office in Milford that evening. I booted up my workstation and navigated to the secure portal for the Connecticut Secretary of State. The process of forming a corporate entity was surprisingly straightforward. I paid the required filing fees and established a new limited liability company. I named the entity Milford Horizon LLC. To ensure strict anonymity, I utilized a registered corporate proxy service to act as the public-facing agent, keeping my own name entirely off the state registry. I contacted a private commercial lender I had met through my analytics work at Vertex Financial Technologies. Using my own unencumbered coastal property and my extensive investment portfolio as collateral, I secured a short-term bridge loan. 3 days after the Colonial hit the market, Milford Horizon LLC submitted a purchase offer. The bid was cold and calculated. I offered the exact asking price, but the terms were merciless. The offer was all cash, waiving every standard contingency. No structural inspections, no lengthy appraisal periods, and no financing delays. The only stipulation was a rigid, mandatory closing date scheduled precisely 2 weeks prior to the settlement deadline Vance Sterling had imposed. Sandra's listing agent called her immediately, urging her to accept the corporate bid. It was the flawless, rapid liquidation they desperately needed to avoid federal prosecution. They signed the acceptance documents the very same afternoon, entirely unaware of the invisible snare closing around their ankles. The irony of the transaction was a masterpiece of poetic justice. I was leveraging my own capital to purchase their home, and the cash they received from that sale would be routed directly into Vance Sterling's escrow account to satisfy their legal debt to me. It was a perfect, closed loop of financial destruction. They were funding their own downfall. The closing day arrived. The title company handled the digital transfer of deeds and the wiring of funds. The ink dried on the municipal records. The massive suburban estate officially belonged to Milford Horizon, LLC. In standard residential real estate transactions, sellers frequently negotiate a brief post-sale occupancy agreement. This allows the former owners a grace period of 30 to 60 days to carefully pack their decades of accumulated possessions and secure new housing. Sandra and Richard's defense attorney had submitted a formal request for a standard 2-month occupancy extension. As the newly minted managing member of the holding company, I reviewed the request. I did not send a polite email declining the offer. I hired a uniformed process server. On a rainy Tuesday morning, the process server arrived at the front door of the Colonial. He handed Sandra a thick, legally binding packet. It contained a formal notice to quit the premises. The corporate landlord had officially denied the occupancy request and was demanding the property be vacated within 30 days. Included in the packet was a required disclosure form identifying the primary shareholder of Milford Horizon, LLC. My phone did not ring. No desperate text messages arrived. They had finally grasped the sheer, terrifying scope of the trap I had built. I had taken the stolen trust fund, multiplied it through the legal system, and used the resulting capital to literally buy the roof over their heads. I was their new landlord, and my first administrative action was serving them with an eviction notice. The ensuing 30 days were a chaotic scramble for my parents. Without the inflated equity of their home, and with a significant portion of the sale proceeds funneled directly into my settlement account, their purchasing power was drastically reduced. They could not afford another property in their affluent, manicured suburb. They could not even pass the rigorous background checks required for premium rental communities, as the lingering shadow of the fraud lawsuit damaged their financial profiles. They were forced to sign a 12-month lease for a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a deteriorating complex situated next to a loud, constant stream of highway traffic in a highly undesirable zip code. Julian, stripped of his real estate license and drowning in his own debt, had to share a tiny secondary bedroom with boxes of their discarded luxury items. Once the property was vacant, I hired a crew of professional contractors. They stripped away the dated, pretentious brass fixtures and painted the walls a sleek, modern, neutral gray. We refinished the hardwood floors and updated the landscaping, erasing every trace of the Richard family aesthetic. I placed the refreshed Colonial back on the open market 2 months later. Unburdened by a desperate deadline, I waited for the optimal buyer. A young, dual-income medical family fell in love with the staged property and offered a significant premium. I flipped the house for a swift 15% profit, routing the resulting capital directly into my retirement accounts. I drove past their new apartment complex exactly once. The building featured faded vinyl siding and a cracked asphalt parking lot. I watched Sandra carry a plastic grocery bag up a narrow flight of concrete stairs. She looked tired, diminished, and ordinary. The grand, commanding matriarch who had orchestrated my exclusion was gone, replaced by a woman facing the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own greed. I did not stop the car. I kept driving toward the coast, heading back to the quiet, secure sanctuary I had built with my own hands. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, unshakable clarity. 18 months have passed since the rhythmic beeping of the hospital monitor served as the soundtrack to my awakening. The passage of time is a fascinating metric. It heals surgical incisions, reducing jagged staples to a thin silver line across the lower right quadrant of my abdomen. It also cures deeper wounds, provided you apply the correct remedy. My remedy was distance, fortified by titanium hardware and airtight legal injunctions. I walk through the entryway of my Milford home. The evening sun filters through the sidelight windows, casting a warm golden pattern across the pristine hardwood floors. I pause by the front door. The smart deadbolt emits a quiet, reassuring sapphire glow. It is a silent sentinel. The motorized clutch rests securely in the locked position, a permanent barrier between my sanctuary and the demands of the outside world. The air inside the house is still, carrying the faint, clean scent of citrus and cedar. There are no sticky cherry popsicle stains on the white linen sofa. There are no greasy pizza boxes ruining imported silk rugs. The silence is not lonely. It is expansive. I move into the custom kitchen, trailing my fingertips along the cool marble of the island. I reach into the temperature-controlled wine refrigerator and extract a dark glass bottle. It features a distinct silver wax seal. It is a vintage Pinot Noir, sourced from the exact same vineyard as the bottle Julian carelessly popped open on my patio a year and a half ago. I use a sleek metal corkscrew, easing the cork free with a soft popping sound. I pour the dark ruby liquid into a crystal glass, watching the wine coat the sides of the bowl. I did not open it immediately. I let it sit for 24 hours, observing my own internal reaction. A year ago, seeing her handwriting might have triggered a spike in my heart rate or a flash of residual anger. Now, I felt only a mild clinical curiosity. When I finally broke the seal, I found 3 pages of lined notebook paper. The ink was smudged in several places, the unmistakable signature of falling tears. Beatrice wrote an apology. It was not the polished public relations performance she posted on social media during her smear campaign. It read like a raw, unfiltered confession from a woman who had finally hit the bottom of her own curated illusion. She apologized for the diner trap. She apologized for watching from the sidelines while our parents drained my education fund. She admitted that she had spent her entire life coasting on the resources they stole from me, hiding behind her children to avoid adult accountability. The eviction from the suburban colonial had forced her to confront the reality of our family dynamic. Without the endless flow of stolen capital and parental bailouts, Beatrice had to secure actual employment. She was working as a receptionist at a dental clinic, trying to support her twins on a rigid, unforgiving budget. I read the 3 pages standing by the kitchen window. I did not experience a triumphant rush of victory. I did not feel a sudden urge to pick up the phone and welcome her back into my life. The apology was necessary for her own moral inventory, but it did not erase the decades of complacency. I did not offer financial assistance. We are no longer actively at war, but we will never be a family. Some bridges, once burned to ashes, are simply not structurally sound enough to rebuild. As for the others, they are phantoms. They exist only in the peripheral vision of my life, occasionally mentioned by Barbara Gable when she shares neighborhood gossip over the garden fence. Richard and Sandra remain in that cramped, noisy apartment near the interstate highway. The proceeds from the forced sale of their estate went directly to satisfying the civil settlement, leaving them with negligible retirement savings. They live a small, restricted existence, counting pennies at the grocery store discount aisles they once sneered at. Julian faces the harshest reality. Stripped of his real estate license and burdened by the public record of his ethical violations, he found the corporate doors of Fairfield County permanently locked. The grapevine indicates he secured a mid-level position at a logistics warehouse, answering phones and tracking inventory shipments. He no longer wears tailored linen suits or drives a luxury sports utility vehicle. He rides a commuter train, trapped in a mundane routine, unable to charm his way into unearned wealth. They are stepping out onto the cedar deck. The evening air is crisp, carrying the briny, invigorating scent of the ocean. The tide is rolling in, the dark waves crashing rhythmically against the rocky shoreline. I lean against the wooden railing, the crystal wine glass cool against my palm. I take a slow, deliberate sip. The Pinot Noir is complex, rich with notes of dark cherry and oak. It tastes infinitely better earned than stolen. For 29 years, I operated under a flawed, inherited thesis. I believed love was a ledger. I thought if I simply worked harder, achieved more, and demanded less, I would eventually earn a place at their table. They taught me that blood is a conditional contract. They demonstrated that their affection was entirely transactional, available only when my resources could be extracted to fund their comfort. When my appendix ruptured, leaving me isolated and physically vulnerable in a sterile hospital ward, they saw an opportunity to exploit my weakness. They calculated my value based on the square footage of my empty house and the depth of my bank accounts. Their critical error was failing to understand the fundamental nature of the target they chose to attack. They thought they were breaking a compliant, exhausted sister. Instead, the pressure they applied acted as a forge. The intense heat of their betrayal burned away the lingering guilt and the archaic sense of familial duty. The brutal, unforgiving process hammered the raw data of my life into a weapon of self-preservation. They accidentally created a woman who could never be manipulated, extorted, or exploited again. The greatest poetic justice I achieved did not come in the form of a six-figure settlement check. It was not the exhilarating moment I purchased their home through a blind corporate entity, nor was it the satisfaction of serving them with an eviction notice. Those were merely the tactical maneuvers required to secure the perimeter. The true, profound payoff is the unshakable peace I wake up to every single morning. It is the luxury of a silent phone. It is the freedom to enjoy the fruits of my grueling labor without a chorus of entitled voices demanding their unearned share. It is the deep cellular knowledge that the sanctuary I built is fortified by my own hands and protected by my own boundaries. I look out across the vast, dark expanse of the Long Island Sound. The water reflects the silver light of the rising moon, a shimmering path stretching out toward the horizon. The wind catches my hair, cool and wild. I am Arianne Richard. I own this house. I own my future. I own my peace. I raise my glass to the empty, quiet deck, offering a silent toast to the digital guillotine, the heavy titanium deadbolt, and the beautiful, ruthless clarity of knowing exactly what I am worth. I take another sip of the wine. I smile into the sea breeze. The view has never been clearer.
We grow up steeped in the mythos of the traditional American family. It is a vision framed by manicured lawns, holiday dinners, and the unspoken, sacred promise of unconditional love and mutual support. But what happens when the very foundation of that family is built not on love, but on a ledger? What happens when the people who are supposed to protect you view your success merely as a resource to be harvested? The story we just explored, Arianne's harrowing journey through familial betrayal, is far more than a shocking drama of changed locks and frozen assets. It is a sobering reflection on the modern family dynamic, serving as a cautionary tale for parents and a profound roadmap for personal and spiritual growth. At the heart of this narrative, providing a solid foundation of ethics and honesty from which they can safely leap into the world. Yet as we saw with Sandra and Richard, that duty was corrupted into something entirely parasitic. They cannibalized their daughter's future, secretly draining her educational trust fund and exploiting her social security number to finance their own curated illusions of suburban success. This is a terrifying reflection of a distorted social reality, where some parents feel a toxic entitlement to the fruits of their children's labor. They viewed Arianne's independence not as a triumph of their parenting, but as a communal bank account to cover the failures of her siblings. True family responsibility dictates that we foster independence, guiding our children. This story dramatically highlights the absolute necessity of fairness and emotional awareness in raising children. Arianne was the successful one, the data analyst who worked grueling 80-hour weeks, scraping and saving to turn a distressed foreclosure into a home with her own bleeding hands. Her siblings, meanwhile, were endlessly coddled. When parents play favorites, excusing the destructive behavior of one child while demanding endless sacrifice from another, they plant the seeds of an inevitable collapse. Sandra weaponized her role as a medical proxy, dismissing her daughter's agonizing hospital recovery as dramatic, just so Julian and Beatrice could enjoy a free coastal vacation. This profound lack of emotional awareness destroyed the invisible trust that holds a family together. Parents must understand that a child's home, their physical and mental space, is a hard-won sanctuary. When you fail to respect those boundaries, you do not just lose a daughter, you turn blood relatives into ghosts. From a deeper, more spiritual perspective, the events that unfolded in that coastal Connecticut town illustrate the universal law of karma, accountability, and the illusion of entitlement. The family members were blinded by their own material attachments and spiritual decay. Julian, drowning in his own manufactured debts, believed he was clever enough to illegally sublet his sister's home to wealthy Manhattanites to cover his gambling losses. Sandra and Richard believed their decades of wire fraud and identity theft would remain safely buried in a counterfeit designer tote bag. Spiritually, this is a profound delusion, the ego's desperate attempt to justify theft and betrayal under the guise of simply helping family. But a life built on deceit is merely a house of cards waiting for a strong wind. The universe demands balance. The very actions they took to exploit Arianne ultimately led to their total ruin. Their comfortable, entitled lives ground to a terrifying halt as they lost their massive suburban home, their careers, and their familial bonds. Accountability is inescapable. The energy we put into the world, especially the energy of betrayal toward our own flesh and blood, will always find its way back to our doorstep. Yet, amidst the wreckage of this family, there is a beautiful, resilient roadmap for self-cultivation. For anyone who has ever felt exploited or marginalized by the people who were supposed to love them most, Arianne's path offers 3 vital pillars of spiritual and personal growth. First, we must cultivate wisdom. Tree Tway. Wisdom is the clarity to see through the fog of emotional manipulation and painkillers. Arianne did not waste her energy in a screaming match. She used her sharp intellect to gather undeniable 4K high-definition evidence. True wisdom is recognizing a toxic environment and possessing the presence of mind to sever the umbilical cord of control. Second, we must uphold ethics. Dao Duk. While her parents lived a life of fraud, Arianne reclaimed her peace not through petty, illegal vengeance, but through cold, calculated justice. She sanitized her life, acting within the bounds of the law to demand exactly what she was owed, moving from being tethered to family guilt to a state of unshakable peace. Finally, developing willpower and resilience, Ni Luk, is essential. Resilience isn't just about surviving, it is about rebuilding. The same willpower that allowed Arianne to gut-renovate a home empowered her to deploy a digital guillotine from a hospital bed. It takes a cold, calculating adrenaline and immense emotional discipline to stand your ground against those who share your DNA. As we navigate the complex, often messy realities of our own familial relationships, stories like this remind us of the power of self-correction and the vital importance of protecting our peace. If you found yourself nodding along to this narrative, if Arianne's struggle resonated with a silent battle you've fought in your own life, I invite you to join our growing community. Please take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel Sophia Told Stories. We share these narratives not just to entertain, but to empower, to heal, and to spark the difficult conversations that can transform our lives. Ultimately, when we repair ourselves, when we remove the clutter of toxic expectations and enforce the boundaries of our own self-worth, we can achieve a life that is immaculate, silent, and entirely our own. But as you look at your own family tree, at the expectations you carry, and the love you offer your children, ask yourself, are you cultivating a sanctuary built on mutual respect and genuine emotional awareness? Or are you quietly writing an invoice for a debt that can never truly be paid? The view from the balcony is always clearer once the storm has passed. But we must decide, long before the rain falls, who we will allow to hold the keys to our doors.